The war had lasted for 5 long years. Humans and the Scifi Empire had fought countless battles across space, leaving destruction in their wake. Millions had died. Both sides wanted victory, but neither could claim it. The war had become a slow, painful struggle with no end in sight. Captain Darius Holt sat in a dimly lit meeting chamber aboard the Horizon, a human diplomatic vessel. Across from him sat a group of Scifi diplomats, their reptilian features unreadable. The Scifi were taller than humans, with smooth silver-blue skin, long curved horns, and piercing golden eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. A human ambassador, General Kane, cleared his throat. "We have one last option. A union between our species." Darius frowned. "What do you mean?" Kane exhaled. "A political marriage." The words hit Darius like a punch to the gut. Marriage. He had been prepared for a dangerous mission, maybe even a suicide run. But this is the only way, Kane continued. Their empire values honor above all. If we unite through blood, through tradition, they will honor the treaty. Darius stared at the general in disbelief. And who's supposed to get married? One of the Scifi, Ambassador Relic, leaned forward. "Our princess, Talissa." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, as if he expected resistance. "She is of royal blood. If she weds a human, our people will accept you as part of our empire. The war will end." Darius clenched his fists. "This is insane." "Not insane," Relic corrected. "Necessary." Another Scifi diplomat, a woman with violet markings on her skin, nodded. "It will be a formal ceremony, a gesture of unity." Darius looked between them, then at General Kane. "And what happens after? Do I just go home?" Silence. The hesitation made his stomach turn. He didn't like it. Not one bit. "We will discuss that later," Kane said finally. Darius knew what that meant. It meant they were hiding something. Before he could argue, the chamber doors opened. She entered. Princess Talissa. She moved gracefully, her long, flowing robes trailing behind her. Her golden eyes locked onto Darius, studying him like a puzzle she was trying to solve. Unlike the others, her expression wasn't cold. It was amused. Darius stood as she approached, trying to hold his ground. She was taller than him by a few inches. Her sharp features were elegant, her presence commanding. "You are the human they have chosen?" she asked. Her voice was smooth, almost melodic, yet held a sharpness beneath it. Darius crossed his arms. "Looks like it." She tilted her head, a hint of a smirk on her lips. "I expected someone different." Darius raised an eyebrow, not sure whether to be insulted or relieved. She chuckled, a soft sound, but one that sent a shiver down his spine. Then she turned to her diplomats. "This marriage is a symbol of peace. Are we all agreed?" They all nodded. Talissa's gaze returned to Darius. "Do you agree?" Every part of him wanted to say no, to refuse this ridiculous idea. He didn't trust the Scifi. He didn't trust politicians either. But he had seen enough war. He had lost friends, watched planets burn, and barely survived missions himself. If this could end the war, did it really matter what he wanted? Darius exhaled slowly. "Fine." Talissa's smirk grew. "Good." The ceremony. The next day, the wedding took place aboard the Horizon. It was not a grand celebration. There were no flowers, no music, no guests cheering. It was a cold, formal affair, attended only by diplomats from both sides. Talissa stood beside him, wearing a ceremonial Scifi robe woven with gold and dark blue threads. A high priestess spoke in their language, reciting vows that Darius barely understood. Then came the moment that unsettled him most. The Scifi did not believe in simple words or rings. Their marriages were sealed through a bonding ritual. The priestess took a small crystal blade, slicing both Darius's palm and Talissa's. She then pressed their hands together. A strange warmth spread through Darius's veins, a tingling sensation racing up his arm. Talissa met his gaze, her golden eyes glowing brighter for a moment. "You are mine now," she whispered. Darius swallowed hard. Something wasn't right. Aftermath. Hours later, Darius sat alone in his assigned quarters, rubbing his palm where the cut had been. The wound had already sealed, faster than it should have. He felt different. His senses were sharper, his heartbeat steadier. He barely had time to think about it before a voice echoed behind him. "You're not sleeping." Darius turned. Talissa stood in the doorway. "Wasn't tired," he said. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You should know something." Darius tensed. "What?" Talissa leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Human marriages can end. Zev-Eri ones do not." His heart stopped. "What?" She smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. "You thought this was temporary." Darius felt his stomach drop. "That's what they told me." Talissa shook her head. "Then they lied." Darius stared at her, realizing the truth too late. He wasn't just pretending to be married. He really was, and he had no way out. Darius Holt stared at the alien princess standing in his room, her golden eyes gleaming under the dim light. Her words echoed in his head. "Human marriages can end. Zev-Eri ones do not." His fingers clenched into fists. "What do you mean?" "They told me this was just political." Talissa tilted her head slightly, a hint of amusement in her expression. "Political?" "Yes." "Temporary?" "No." She stepped closer, her smooth robes brushing against the floor. "The Zev-Eri do not take marriage lightly. Our bonding ritual is permanent." Darius's heart pounded in his chest. He lifted his palm, looking at the faint mark where the ritual cut had been made. He had felt something strange when their blood mixed, a warmth spreading through his veins. At the time, he thought it was just ceremonial magic or alien technology. But now he wasn't so sure. "You're joking," he said, though deep inside, he knew she wasn't. Talissa smiled. "No, Captain. I do not joke about such things." Darius took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "So what does this mean for me?" Talissa studied him for a moment, then answered calmly. "It means you belong to me, as I belong to you. Your body is now linked to mine." Darius took a step back. "Linked? How?" She sighed. "You will feel it soon. The bond is not just symbolic, it is biological, mental, and spiritual. If you try to leave me, you will weaken. Your body will reject separation. The farther you go, the worse it will become." Darius's stomach twisted. "This is insane." Talissa crossed her arms. "You agreed to this, did you not?" Darius felt anger boil in his chest. "I agreed because I thought it was just a political stunt. No one told me this was for life." Talissa raised an eyebrow. "That is not my problem." Darius turned away, running a hand through his hair. He needed time to think. This was too much. He had come here believing he was making a temporary sacrifice for peace, but instead, he had been trapped. He had fought in wars, survived impossible missions, but nothing had prepared him for this. A strange feeling. The next morning, Darius woke up with a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't pain, but a dull ache, like something was missing. He sat up, rubbing his forehead. He felt different. He could sense something that wasn't his own thoughts. A presence. And then, a knock at his door. Before he could respond, the door slid open, and Talissa stepped inside. She looked at him with a knowing expression. "You feel it now, don't you?" Darius narrowed his eyes. "What did you do to me?" Talissa shook her head. "Not me. The bond. It is part of you now." She sat down on a nearby chair, folding her hands elegantly in her lap. "You can sense me, can't you?" Darius hesitated. He could. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel her presence, somewhere at the edge of his mind, like a faint pulse in the background. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there. And he hated it. "I don't want this," he muttered. Talissa sighed. "It does not matter what you want, Captain. The bond is complete." Darius's jaw tightened. Then there must be a way to break it. Her eyes darkened. No. Silence filled the room. Darius stood up sharply. "I need to talk to General Kane. If they tricked me into this, they can fix it." Talissa shook her head. "You can try. But if you walk too far from me, you will see the truth for yourself." Darius ignored her warning and stormed out. The consequences. He made his way through the corridors of the human diplomatic vessel, trying to push the strange feeling away. He reached the command center, where General Kane stood discussing matters with the other human officials. Darius walked up to him, his anger barely controlled. "You lied to me." Kane turned, a guilty look in his eyes. "Captain Holt, listen." "No," Darius cut him off. "You told me this was just politics. You've never said anything about a permanent bond." Kane sighed, rubbing his temples. We didn't think it mattered." Darius's blood boiled. "Didn't think it mattered. I can feel her in my head." Kane opened his mouth to say something, but suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Darius's chest. His vision blurred, his breath caught, and his legs nearly buckled. The ache he felt earlier was now an unbearable pressure. His heart raced, his body screamed in protest. "Captain." One of the officers reached out to steady him. Darius gritted his teeth, gasping. What was happening to him? Then a voice cut through his thoughts. "Come back." Talissa's voice. No, not her real voice. Her voice in his mind. Darius clenched his fists. No. The pain grew worse. His lungs burned, his heartbeat pounded in his ears. He couldn't take it. With a deep, shuddering breath, he forced himself to walk back toward Talissa's quarters. With each step, the pain lessened. His mind cleared, his heartbeat steadied. By the time he reached the door, he could breathe normally again. The door slid open. Talissa stood there, watching him with quiet amusement. "I told you," she said softly. Darius, breathing hard, finally understood. He really was bound to her. He had no way out. And now he had to figure out what that meant. Darius Holt stood frozen at the doorway, his breath still heavy from the strange episode. The pain had disappeared the moment he returned to Talissa's side, confirming his worst fear. He really was bonded to her. The Zevari princess watched him with a calm expression, as if she had expected this outcome all along. "Now you understand, Captain," she said, her golden eyes steady on him. Darius clenched his fists. "This isn't right." Talissa tilted her head slightly. "It is our way." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to argue, to fight, to demand a way out. But what could he do? He had walked away, and the pain had nearly crippled him. He was a soldier, trained to withstand all kinds of torture, yet his own body had betrayed him. There was no denying it. He was trapped. But he wasn't going to just accept it. "You said this is biological," Darius muttered, more to himself than to her. "Then there has to be a cure. A way to undo it." Talissa's lips twitched, almost like she wanted to laugh, but she held it back. "You can search if you wish, but you will not find one." Darius stepped forward, his anger rising. "And what if I don't want this bond? What if I refuse to stay here?" Talissa remained composed, but her gaze darkened slightly. "Then you will suffer, you will weaken, and eventually you will die." Darius's stomach twisted. He refused to believe it, but his body's reaction said otherwise. He had only been away from her for a few minutes, and it had nearly killed him. "You call this marriage?" He spat. "This is slavery." For the first time, Talissa's expression shifted. It wasn't anger, but something else. Something close to disappointment. "You think you are my prisoner?" she asked, voice quieter now. "You are not. I did not force you to accept the bond. I did not lie to you. It was your people who deceived you, not me. Darius opened his mouth to argue, but she was right. It wasn't her fault. It was his own government that had sent him into this trap. A bitter realization settled in his chest. He had been nothing more than a pawn. A desperate search. Darius refused to sit around and accept his fate. For the next few days, he spent every waking moment trying to figure out how to break the bond. He spoke with the human scientists aboard the diplomatic ship, demanded answers from his commanders, even consulted Sci-Fi scholars. The result? Nothing. Every explanation led back to the same answer. There was no way to undo it. The Sci-Fi bonding ritual had never been broken before. It was absolute. His frustration boiled over. He slammed his fist against the metal wall of his quarters, his knuckles aching from the impact. This wasn't just unfair. It was a betrayal. His own leaders had done this to him, knowing full well that it was permanent. They had tricked him into believing it was temporary, all for the sake of peace. And now, they didn't care what happened to him. The worst part, a small part of him could still feel Talissa. Even when she wasn't in the same room, her presence lingered in the back of his mind like a whisper. He couldn't read her thoughts, but he knew when she was nearby, knew when she was watching him. And deep down, he could sense something else. She wasn't as indifferent as she pretended to be. The assassination attempt. That night, Darius stood outside the observation deck, staring at the vastness of space. He needed time to think, to clear his head. Then he heard it. The sound of a blade slicing through the air. His instincts kicked in. He dodged, just in time. A sharp dagger barely missed his throat. Darius spun around to see a Sci-Fi soldier, his eyes filled with hatred. "You do not belong here, human," the assassin hissed. "Your kind is weak. You defile our princess." Darius barely had time to react before the soldier lunged again. He blocked the attack, twisting the assassin's arm and sending the dagger clattering to the floor. But the Sci-Fi wasn't done. He pulled out another weapon, a plasma blade, glowing with deadly energy. Darius braced himself for the next strike. Then, a blur of movement. Talissa appeared out of nowhere. With precise speed, she grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisting it sharply. The soldier cried out in pain, dropping the blade. In a single motion, she drove her elbow into his chest, sending him crashing to the floor. Darius stood frozen, staring at her in shock. The Sci-Fi princess had just saved his life. The assassin groaned in pain, struggling to get up, but Talissa stepped forward, her voice cold as ice. "You dare attack my mate?" The soldier's eyes widened in horror. "Princess, Silence." Her voice was like steel. She turned to the guards, who had arrived late. "Take him away. Let my people see what happens when loyalty is broken." The guards hesitated for only a moment before dragging the assassin away. Darius exhaled, his heartbeat still racing. Talissa turned to him, her golden eyes fierce. "Are you hurt?" Darius shook his head. "I'm fine." A long silence stretched between them. Then she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "Now do you see?" Darius frowned. "See what?" Talissa stepped closer. "This is not a cage for you, Captain. It is a shield. You are part of something bigger now, whether you accept it or not." Darius swallowed hard. "And if I don't want it?" Talissa held his gaze. "Then I will protect you anyway." Darius Holt sat in his quarters, his mind racing. His heart was still pounding from the assassination attempt. He had fought in wars, survived enemy ambushes, but this was different. He had always known the Sci-Fi wouldn't accept a human as their princess's mate, but he never expected someone to try and kill him. And yet, Talissa had protected him. That moment replayed in his mind. The way she moved, fast and precise, how easily she had taken down the assassin. She could have let him die, but she hadn't. Instead, she had called him something that sent chills down his spine. "My mate." Darius exhaled, rubbing his face with his hands. He didn't know what to make of it. He didn't belong here. He wasn't her mate. He had never wanted to be. This whole marriage was a mistake, a political game he had been trapped in. But if that was true, why was she still protecting him? A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. The door to his quarters slid open. Talissa stepped inside, her golden eyes unreadable. She was calm, her movements graceful, but Darius could feel something beneath the surface. She was angry. "You're lucky to be alive, Captain," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Darius looked at her. "Yeah, thanks to you." Talissa sighed, stepping closer. "Do you still believe this bond is a cage?" Darius clenched his fists. "I never asked for this." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Neither did I." That made him pause. He hadn't thought about it before. Did she even want this marriage? "You think I chose you?" she asked, as if reading his mind. "That I wanted to be bound to a human." Darius frowned. "Didn't you?" Talissa shook her head. "I agreed to this union for the sake of my people, to end the war, just as you did." She sighed, crossing her arms. "But unlike you, I understood what it meant." Darius exhaled slowly. "And what does it mean, exactly?" Talissa studied him for a moment. "It means you are part of my people now, whether you accept it or not. And as my mate, I will protect you. But that protection only lasts as long as you stand by my side." Darius felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just talking about tradition. She was warning him. If he rejected the bond, there would be consequences, a dangerous choice. The next day, Darius received a message from General Kane. "Captain Holt, we need to talk. Urgent." Darius made his way to the human section of the diplomatic ship, ignoring the strange sensation in his chest. The further he walked from Talissa, the more he felt the dull ache returning. It wasn't as intense as before, but it was there, a constant reminder of the bond. When he entered the meeting room, General Kane and 2 other officers were waiting. "Darius," Kane said, motioning for him to sit. Darius crossed his arms. "What's this about?" Kane sighed. "The Scifi don't trust us. There are factions who want to restart the war. And now, after the assassination attempt, things are worse." Darius narrowed his eyes. "Worse how?" The officer beside Kane spoke. "They think you're weak, that the princess is wasting her time on you." Darius gritted his teeth. "So, let them think that." Kane hesitated. Then he leaned forward. "There's another way out of this, Darius." Darius felt his stomach tighten. "What way?" Kane exhaled. "Defect. Leave the Scifi. Come back to Earth." Darius stared at him. "Are you insane?" "I can't leave. You know what happens if I do." Kane's expression hardened. "We'll find a way to break the bond." Darius let out a bitter laugh. "There is no way. You lied to me. You knew this was permanent, didn't you?" Kane didn't deny it. He simply said, "I didn't have a choice." Darius's blood boiled. "Neither did I." Silence filled the room. Finally, Kane spoke again. "Listen, Darius. You're a soldier. You know how this works. Right now, the Scifi think they have control over you. But if you leave, it could shift the balance of power. Show them that humans won't be controlled." Darius clenched his fists. "And what happens to Talissa?" Kane hesitated. "That's not your problem." Darius's chest tightened. He didn't trust the Scifi, but he trusted the human leadership even less. They had used him, tricked him, and now they wanted him to abandon the one person who had actually tried to protect him. Talissa had saved his life, and now they wanted him to betray her. The decision. Darius walked back toward the Scifi quarters, his mind a storm of thoughts. Every step he took, the ache in his body faded, replaced by something else. Something stronger. By the time he reached Talissa's chamber, he knew his answer. The doors slid open. Talissa stood inside, waiting for him. She looked at him carefully, as if she already knew. "You saw Cain," she said. Darius nodded. "Yeah. And he told you to leave." Another nod. Talissa's golden eyes flickered with something. Not anger, but sadness. "Are you going to?" Darius exhaled. "No." Talissa stared at him, searching his face. Why? He didn't have a simple answer. He should have wanted to leave, should have taken the first chance to return home. But something had changed. Maybe it was the way the humans had used him. Maybe it was the way Talissa had saved him. Or maybe, deep down, he already knew the truth. He wasn't just bonded to her. He was starting to trust her. Darius stepped closer, his voice firm. "Because you're the only one who hasn't lied to me." Talissa's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. For the first time since this started, she smiled. Not a smirk, not amusement. A real smile. And somehow, that terrified Darius more than anything else. Darius Holt had made his decision. He wasn't leaving. As he stood in Talissa's chamber, he could feel the weight of his choice settling in. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about the bond. He had chosen to stay because Talissa was the only one who hadn't betrayed him. The moment he said the words, he saw something in her golden eyes. Relief. "You're certain?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Darius nodded. "I don't trust the Scifi, but I trust my own people even less right now." He crossed his arms. "And besides, leaving means dying. I'm not that stupid." Talissa let out a quiet breath, almost like she had been holding it. "Then you must understand something, Captain." She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "If you stay, you are not just my mate in name. You are part of my people. That means you must stand with me, through everything." Darius held her gaze. He knew what she was saying. This wasn't just about being trapped in a marriage. This was about loyalty. For the first time since this mess started, he realized he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a symbol. And symbols could start wars, or end them. "I understand," he said finally. Talissa studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Then we have much to do." The gathering storm. 2 days later, Darius stood beside Talissa in the great hall of the Scifi Council. It was an enormous chamber made of black stone, with golden banners hanging from the walls. The most powerful Scifi leaders sat in a semicircle, their piercing eyes fixed on Darius. Talissa stood tall, her regal presence commanding the room. "The human remains with us. He is my mate, and he will not be harmed." One of the council members, a high-ranking warlord named Scifi, let out a scoff. "A human does not deserve a place among us." His dark silver skin shimmered under the dim lights, his expression one of clear disdain. Darius clenched his fists but said nothing. This wasn't his battle to fight. Talissa's expression didn't change. "The treaty was signed. The war has ended. If any of you wish to challenge my decision, you will challenge the peace itself." Murmurs filled the chamber. Zelfar's sharp gaze flickered between them. "Then prove it, Princess. Prove that he is one of us." Darius narrowed his eyes. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that?" Zelfar's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Through the rite of acceptance." Silence fell over the chamber. Talissa's expression turned cold. "That is not necessary." Zelfar shrugged. "It is if he wants to be accepted. Unless, of course, you are afraid he will fail." Darius had no idea what the rite of acceptance was, but judging by the look on Talissa's face, it wasn't something she wanted him to do. Talissa turned to him, speaking in a low voice. "It is an ancient test, a trial of endurance. If you refuse, I will not force you." Darius felt every eye in the room on him. He knew what was happening. Zelfar was challenging him, trying to prove that humans were weak. Backing down wasn't an option. Darius squared his shoulders. "I'll do it." Talissa's golden eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she nodded. Very well. Zelfar smirked. Then let us see if a human is worthy of standing beside our princess. The trial. The rite of acceptance took place inside a massive underground cavern beneath the Scifi capital. The trial was simple: survive the arena against one of their war beasts. Darius stood in the center of the stone arena, gripping a Scifi combat staff. He had no armor, no advanced weapons, just his training and instincts. Across from him, a massive beast emerged. It was a reptilian predator, its scales dark as the void, its red eyes filled with hunger. It stood over 8 feet tall, its muscular frame built for destruction. The arena walls shook as it stepped forward. From above, the council watched in silence. Talissa stood at the front, her expression unreadable. Darius took a deep breath. This was it. The beast charged. Darius rolled to the side just in time, barely dodging its claws. It moved fast, faster than something its size should be able to. Darius's military instincts took over. He studied its movements, looking for weaknesses. It lunged again. This time, Darius countered. He ducked low, slamming the combat staff into its knee joint. The beast roared, stumbling slightly. The crowd murmured. Darius didn't hesitate. He kept moving, staying one step ahead. The beast was strong but predictable. He dodged, struck, dodged again. Then, a mistake. The beast swiped at him with its tail, catching him off guard. The impact sent him flying, slamming into the arena wall. Pain exploded through his ribs. Above, Talissa took a step forward, her fists clenched. Darius groaned, pushing himself up. His vision blurred for a moment, but he forced himself to focus. The beast charged at him again. He had one chance. At the last second, Darius dodged, but instead of retreating, he moved in. He grabbed the combat staff with both hands and drove it straight into the beast's throat. The beast choked, its roar turning into a gurgle. It staggered backward, its massive form collapsing onto the ground. The arena fell silent. Darius stood victorious. Above, Selthar's smirk vanished. Talissa's golden eyes shone with something new: pride. Then she turned to the council. Do any of you still doubt him? Silence. Then, slowly, one by one, the council members bowed their heads. Darius had earned his place. Darius Holt stood in the center of the arena, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. His body ached from the fight, but he had won. The massive Scifi war beast lay defeated at his feet. The once roaring crowd was now silent, their disbelief hanging in the air. Darius turned his gaze upward, toward the council members seated above him. He wasn't sure what reaction to expect: anger, resentment, another challenge. But he saw something he hadn't seen before: respect. Even Warlord Selfar, who had sneered at him earlier, now looked at him with a guarded expression. And then, one by one, the council members lowered their heads. Darius didn't know much about Scifi customs, but he knew enough. They had accepted him. He lifted his gaze to Talissa. She stood tall on the viewing platform, her golden eyes locked onto his. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. She was proud of him. But as the moment stretched, Darius knew something else. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Whispers of betrayal. Later that night, Darius sat in Talissa's chambers, wrapping a bandage around his bruised arm. The fight had left him sore, but his thoughts weighed heavier than his wounds. Talissa stood near the balcony, looking out at the vast city beyond. The moonlight reflected off her silver-blue skin, making her look almost otherworldly. You did well today, she said finally. Darius smirked. Not bad for a human, huh? Talissa turned, tilting her head slightly. Not bad at all. There was a hint of amusement in her voice, but also something else, something deeper. Darius hesitated, then asked, "What happens now?" Talissa's expression hardened. "The council has accepted you, but not everyone will. Darius frowned. You mean Selfar? Talissa nodded. He is not the only one. There are those who still see you as an outsider, and they are looking for an excuse to challenge this union. Darius exhaled. So the fight wasn't enough. Talissa's golden eyes met his. No. The real battle has just begun. She stepped closer, her gaze sharp. I need you to trust me, Darius. No matter what happens. Darius held her gaze. He had been tricked before, by his own leaders, by the people he thought he could trust. But Talissa had never lied to him. I trust you, he said. Something flickered in her expression, something close to relief. Then we must prepare, she said. Darius leaned forward. Prepare for what? Talissa's voice was steady, but there was tension beneath it. For war, an impossible choice. The next day, Darius was called back to the human section of the diplomatic ship. He wasn't sure why, but he had a bad feeling. When he entered the meeting chamber, General Kane was waiting. Darius's gut twisted. What do you want? Kane sighed, rubbing his temples. Darius, listen. We have a situation. Darius crossed his arms. You always have a situation. Get to the point. Kane hesitated, then slid a datapad across the table. Read this. Darius glanced at the screen. His blood ran cold. Human forces were preparing for an attack. Darius looked up sharply. What the hell is this? Kane exhaled. There are factions on Earth that don't trust this peace. They believe the Zev-Eri will betray us eventually, so they're planning a preemptive strike. Darius's hands clenched into fists. This will start another war. Kane nodded. Yes, unless you stop it. Darius frowned. What do you mean? Kane leaned forward. You have influence now. You're their so-called human prince. If you publicly declare your allegiance to humanity and leave the Zev-Eri, it could stop the attack. Darius stared at him. You want me to betray Talissa? Kane didn't flinch. I want you to do what's right. The question is, where do your loyalties lie? Darius's stomach twisted. This was exactly what he had feared. A choice. Betray the Zev-Eri and prevent a war, or stand by Talissa and risk everything. Kane's voice was low. Think carefully, Captain. One wrong move, and millions could die. A bond tested. That night, Darius returned to Talissa. She could sense something was wrong the moment he stepped inside. What happened? Darius didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, at the woman he had once considered his enemy. Now she was the only person he truly trusted. Finally, he spoke. The humans are planning an attack. Talissa's expression didn't change. I know. Darius blinked. You? Knew. Talissa nodded. I received word this morning. That's why I said we must prepare. Darius ran a hand through his hair. Kane wants me to leave. If I do, the attack won't happen. Talissa studied him carefully. And will you? Darius exhaled. No. She tilted her head. Even if it means war. Darius met her gaze. I won't betray you. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, she stepped forward and did something unexpected. She placed a hand on his chest. The warmth of her touch sent a strange feeling through him. Not the forced pull of the bond, but something real. Then we will fight, she whispered. Darius nodded. Together. Talissa's lips curved into a small, rare smile. Yes, together. At that moment, Darius realized this wasn't just survival anymore. He was choosing her, and he would face whatever came next by her side. The war between the Terran Republic and the Xel'Veri Empire had dragged on for decades. The Xel'Veri, an advanced and proud alien race, had always seen humans as weaker, unworthy rivals. In a last attempt at peace, the Xel'Veri king, Vornar, offers a solution, his own daughter, Princess Saria, in a diplomatic marriage to a human. But there's a catch. Saria is rumored to be infertile, making her useless as an heir. Commander Nathan Carter, a decorated human soldier, is chosen to be her husband. To him, this marriage is nothing more than political theater, a means to secure peace and return home. But when he meets Saria, she is not what he expected. She is fierce, intelligent, and strangely defiant, and she has no intention of being a passive bride. Part 2. An unexpected bond. From the beginning, their relationship is tense. Saria resents being treated like a pawn, and Nathan refuses to act like her captor. The marriage is purely ceremonial, but customs dictate that they must live together. Despite their differences, Saria begins to see Nathan as more than just a human. Unlike the Scifi, he treats her with honesty, respect, and even humor. Meanwhile, Nathan starts to notice strange things about Saria. Though she is supposedly infertile, her body reacts differently to him. She is physically stronger, more resilient, and even her energy levels change when she is near him. Something is happening, but neither of them understand what. Part 3. The truth about her infertility. One night, Saria collapses in pain, her body shaking. Nathan rushes to her side, but the palace doctors dismiss it as a genetic weakness. Determined to help, Nathan secretly runs tests on her using human medical technology. What he discovers shocks him. Saria isn't infertile. Her body simply rejects Scifi mates. Her species had misinterpreted this as infertility for years, but her body is perfectly compatible with a human. When Nathan tells her the truth, Saria is stunned. She had spent her entire life believing she was broken, but now she realizes it was a lie. And worse, she realizes what the Scifi king had truly done. Her father hadn't given her away as a diplomatic gift. He had discarded her. Months pass, and to everyone's disbelief, Saria is pregnant. The news spreads like wildfire, shocking both humans and Scifi. When King Vornar hears of it, his fury is uncontrollable. To him, this is a humiliation. The daughter he had cast away, the infertile failure, is carrying a child. And worse, the father is a human. He immediately demands her return. But Saria, for the first time, defies him. She refuses to go back, knowing that her child will never be accepted among the Scifi. Nathan, too, stands his ground. She's not your property, he tells the king. She's my wife, and this is my family. King Vornar does not take defiance lightly. He declares the treaty broken, and war inevitable. Part 5. A fight for their future. With war looming, Nathan and Saria prepare for the worst. But something unexpected happens. Many Scifi begin to question their own beliefs. The idea that a human and a Scifi could conceive a child shakes the very foundation of their culture. Some begin to wonder, if Saria isn't broken, then what else has the empire lied about? Saria sees this as an opportunity. She contacts hidden allies among her people, trying to prevent war before it begins. But her father refuses to listen. Then, an assassination attempt is made on Saria. She survives, but now Nathan knows one thing for sure. This isn't just about war anymore. King Vornar wants their child dead. Part 6. The final stand. With both human and Scifi forces preparing for battle, Nathan and Saria make a desperate plan. They will confront King Vornar directly. Risking everything, they infiltrate the Scifi capital, exposing the king's actions to his own people. Nathan publicly reveals the truth about Saria's fertility, proving that the king discarded his own daughter out of ignorance and fear. The revelation divides the Scifi. Many begin to see Saria as a rightful leader. Facing a growing rebellion, King Vornar makes his last move. He challenges Nathan to a duel. If Nathan wins, the war ends, and Saria is free. If he loses, the child dies. Part 7. A new legacy. The duel is brutal. Nathan, a human, is outmatched in strength, but not in strategy. He uses speed, intelligence, and sheer determination to overcome the king. At the final moment, he spares Vorner's life, but demands one thing: that he acknowledges Saria's right to live as she chooses. With his empire turning against him, Vornar has no choice but to surrender. Saria is free. The war ends not with blood, but with truth. Months later, Saria and Nathan welcome their child, the first of a new generation, a true bridge between species. As Nathan holds his newborn son in his arms, he realizes this was never about war. It was about breaking the cycle of hatred and proving that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in battle, but in choosing to build something new. The child of a human and an alien princess would change the stars forever.